Well, it's great to see everybody this morning. My name is Seth Brown. I've had the chance to meet many of you, but if I haven't yet, that's my name. This is, those of you who've been here the last few weeks, you're probably tired of seeing this face, but the good news is I saw a lot of people shaking their heads, which I didn't really love, but the good news is we've got 2 more weeks in our Faithful Life series, so go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 7. And so I'm sharing today, and then you'll get to hear from Bill Clemenson next week. He's going to bring a strong word. I'm looking forward to hearing that. And so this has been a really, really good series looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And so it's been powerful. It's been convicting. And today we're going to look at a really, really challenging passage, to be honest with you. And as I was studying this passage, a lot of it resonated with my story. And so before we read it, let me kind of tell you what I mean there. You know, I share a lot how I started following Jesus at 19 years old, but I was not one of those 19-year-olds who knew nothing about Jesus and lived like a totally anti-Christian lifestyle. Actually, up to the point where I was 19, so if somebody would have looked at me, they would have looked at me like a cultural Christian. I was in and out of church. I went with my family some, then I stopped going, and then in high school I went again with a friend. And even at that church I went to with my friend in high school, overall I had a good experience there. And I was even in 2 plays, believe it or not, right? I was chosen to be the devil in both of the plays. So there were hints that I wasn't really following Jesus. I just wasn't aware of him at the time. And so I was semi-connected to this church. I would pray, and I was in these plays, and I did a lot of religious activity, but I never sensed genuine intimacy with Jesus. And the issue during those years for me, where I look back and I realize I don't really think I was following Jesus, is because I look back on those years and I realize I was putting all the trust I had in myself and what I was doing or not doing. I was not putting trust in Jesus, who had done it all for me. And so because I was putting trust in myself and whether I was doing good or doing bad, what happened was I felt perpetually exhausted. I felt anxious. I felt like I wasn't performing enough for God. And then what I did is I ran away from him my freshman year of college. And then I was invited back to church, and something clicked for me, and I realized I could never do enough to earn God's favor. I have to follow the feet of Jesus and accept that what he has done for me counts for me. I can't add to it. I didn't earn it. I don't deserve it. I simply have to receive it. And it finally clicked at 19 for me, and it reached the level of my heart, and it hadn't up until that point. And so we're gonna read this passage where Jesus is warning us against trusting anything other than himself. He's gonna share a stark warning with us. And on the surface, it's gonna be scary, but when you actually dig underneath, what you'll find is that Jesus is beckoning us to trust in him and him alone. Not in what we do, but in what he has done. So let's go ahead and read our passage. We're gonna do Matthew 7, starting in verse 21, just gonna read a few verses. Jesus says this: "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" So let's catch up and actually get some context here of what's going on. So Matthew 7, if you remember, it's the beginning of the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is pushing the audience to make a choice based on what they've heard up to this point. So a couple weeks ago, we looked at the narrow road and the wide road that Jesus talks about. Jesus beckons us to enter by the narrow way. He is the gate of the narrow way. We go to the narrow way through Jesus by grace alone, through faith alone. But then there's also a wide way. The narrow way seems hard and is hard, but it opens up to life, okay? The wide way that Jesus warns us against it seems easy at first. It's do what feels good, do what you want to do, and it starts out broad and wide, and then it will narrow down into your ruin. And that's living life by your own terms in your own way. That's what he warns us against. And then the next week, he warns us against the voices that we listen to. He talks about false teachers and the fruits that they produce or don't produce. And he says, listen, you've got Jesus calling you by the narrow way, and then you're going to have people in your life who are false teachers who are going to beckon you to take the wide way. They want to devour you, and they want to call you down the wide road that's going to lead you to ruin. And Jesus says, don't follow the false voices. Recognize them by what they do, not what they say. And then today, we're going to look at one last obstacle to embracing this kingdom life that Jesus offers us. The last obstacle to truly embracing this kingdom life that Jesus offers us is ourselves. It's ourselves. And we're going to look, and this passage here, it really shows us the fruit of false teaching. False teaching produces false Christians. False teaching produces people who are self-deceived or people who trust in their own works to earn their way to heaven. That's what it does. And so we need to evaluate this, because what happens is when we read this passage, there's really two common responses to this, okay? The first common response when you hear this passage is to think, this is for your like self-critical kind of anxious types. You read this passage and you'll automatically think, God is going to reject me because there's no way I'm doing enough. God is going to reject me because there's just no way that I'm doing enough. And you know what? That's kind of my first reaction when I read this, because that's just kind of the way that I'm wired. But the truth is, when you actually dig underneath the surface, it's not that God is going to reject you because you're not doing enough. It's actually the opposite. God says you can't do enough. You can't cast out demons and earn your way to heaven. You can't do all the mighty religious things and earn your way to heaven. The only way to really be saved is to know Jesus and trust in him. You can't do enough. You just can't. So you got to set that aside if that's you and you hear this passage. But then the other group in here is sometimes when you read this passage, you just start thinking about other people in your life who this is describing. You start thinking about people who you deem to be false, you deem to be a fake Christian or whatever. And I want to warn you, this passage is not meant to usher us to think about other people. In fact, at the beginning of Matthew chapter 7, what does Jesus say? He says, don't judge. Don't point out the speck in somebody else's eye while you got a plank sticking out of your own eye. Right? You don't need to worry about the destination of somebody else. You need to hear the words of Jesus and see it as an invitation to self-examination, not condemnation of other people. Okay. Now, let's actually look at what Jesus says and see what he's trying to tell us and teach us. Read with me again, verse 21. We're going to look at two things that can't save us here, and then one who can save us. Verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Here's the basic reality. There is not a special password, there is not the right words, or there's not the right rituals that you can say to get yourself right with Jesus. The first thing that cannot save you, and you got to be aware of, are empty words. Empty words. They cannot save you. Just saying stuff to say it can't save you. And what Jesus is doing is he's actually pointing out this human tendency towards self-deception, where we say one thing and actually mean something else. And just to be clear, it's actually a good thing to call Jesus Lord. Paul tells us to do this in Romans 10:9. Confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. But it also goes on to say, but believe in your what? Heart. Heart. Words that match actually the heart posture is what Jesus is referring to. We all have this tendency towards self-deception. A lot of us think we don't. Let me tell you, a fairly innocent story about my own self-deception. So a couple weeks ago, I realized I'm like one of those, I think I've said this before, but I'm one of those people that try to fix stuff because YouTube exists. I'm not naturally mechanically minded or not naturally an engineer type, but if it's on YouTube, I'll try it and get myself in a mess. And so the other day, I made a really big mistake on my truck. I accidentally put, I'll explain what this is because I assume not all of you guys are mechanics. I'm not. I accidentally put power steering fluid in the brake system. I guess some of you guys have done that before or have heard of somebody. Well, here's what happened before you start judging me, okay? I realized, don't judge. The Bible says that. I realized my brake fluid was low one day, and so like some lights started coming on. I was running late, so I ran into my garage. I grabbed what I thought was brake fluid, topped it off, went on my way, lights went off. I felt great. 2 weeks later, I was having a great day. I think it was a Saturday. Things were going great. I was in my garage about to do, every man's pastime, piddling around in the garage. And then I look on my workbench and I see a bottle of power steering fluid. And I think to myself, I'm pretty sure that's what I put in my brake lines. So at that moment, and this was like 2 weeks after this had happened, I just realized I think that's what I put in there. And then what happened was I probably didn't do that. I started to try to deceive myself. So what did I do? I looked on my Amazon account. I was like, I probably bought brake fluid and then dumped it in, and I probably threw the bottle away. So I looked on my Amazon account because that's where I would have bought it. No record of ever buying brake fluid. Looked in the trash can to see maybe I went to AutoZone and bought some. There's no empty bottle of brake fluid in the trash can. But what happened was I was trying to weave a story in my head because I hadn't felt the effects of what this problem could cause. If you don't know, pouring power steering fluid in your brake lines can basically ruin everything in your brake system, okay? So don't do that. And I didn't realize that until a quick Google search. And everybody said, this is catastrophic, you're a dummy, please fix this. I didn't want to face the truth, you know why? Because I was embarrassed. So I started making up a story in my head what could have happened. So I didn't want to call Katie and said, hey, I know, I just spent some money on my truck doing some other stuff, but I also may have made a preventable but catastrophic mistake. And I didn't want to call my mechanic, who I like to act like I know what I'm doing, my mechanic, even though they know I don't know what I'm doing. But I like to act like it. And tell him, hey, I did something not very smart. Here's what I did. Can you help me? And before you feel bad for me, we got it all fixed. It wasn't that bad. It ended up being the best case scenario, so we're all good there. But I was trying to deceive myself because sometimes it's harder to face the truth of a situation for us mentally, so we'll just believe a lie instead. And for our spiritual lives, some of us have grown up in the church. Some of us are so familiar with spiritual language that we have got to be really, really careful that we're not trusting the fact that we grew up in church or we grew up in the South or that my family has a bunch of preachers in it. That stuff can't save you. Being around Christianity is not what saves you. It is an encounter and experience, and trusting in Jesus is what saves you. And so what Jesus does to help us not be self-deceived, because he loves you too much to not warn you, is what he says is he contrasts just paying lip service to God with actually doing the will of the Father, is what he says in verse 21. Because if you remember, Jesus' critique of the religious leaders of the day was summed up in this phrase that he quotes from Isaiah. He says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And Jesus doesn't want us to be self-deceived. So what he says to do is he says, learn to align your lips with your life. Do the will of the Father. Okay, what does this mean? What does it mean to actually do the will of the Father? Because this is the antidote to self-deception. It's to do the will of the Father. Well, here's what this does not mean, just to be very clear. Jesus is not saying you achieve God's favor through obedience. He's not saying that you achieve perfection or that if your life isn't completely changed and perfect, that you're not doing the Father's will and you're going to hell and you're wrong. That's not what Jesus is saying. If you look closely at what he means by doing the Father's will, what he's saying is the Father's will, according to the Bible, is first to believe in the one in whom he has sent, Jesus. That's doing the Father's will, is to believe in the one in whom he has sent. Then when you trust in Jesus, your heart has the capacity to receive his teachings and allow them to also change you over time. If you look closely at the Sermon on the Mount is about a heart-level obedience. Jesus is not telling us, get your life together if you want to be in my kingdom. He's saying, believe me from the heart, and as you receive my teachings in your heart, it will change you from the inside out. So the way that we align our lips with our life is not by just like gritting our teeth and trying harder and trying to tape spiritual fruit on the limbs of our life. No, it's about looking at the soil of your heart and directing your gaze, your focus, your faith on the only one who can save you, and that's Jesus. Believe in the one in whom he is sent. That is doing the will of the Father. That's what it is. This is not about earning God's love through obedience. This is not about achieving perfection. And I want to be clear. This change happens slowly over time. Happens slowly over time. Dallas Willard actually, he helps us here. He says this, the will of my Father is the very thing that Jesus has just gone over in the discourse. Doing what he said, beginning from believe in the one in whom he has sent, we enter the flow of God's ways. We enter the kingdom of the heavens. That is what Jesus is talking about here. You believe in the one in whom he has sent, you enter the flow of God's ways, and you start to be changed from the heart, and then you are entering into the kingdom of heaven. So another thing that's important to realize here, because this is not Jesus saying, you've got to do enough to be saved, you got to do enough to earn. No, he's just saying be changed from the heart by believing in who I've sent. Be changed from the heart and let that change your life. That's what's happening. But you got to realize that God wants to give you grace for free, and grace is opposed to earning. We can't earn it, it's a free gift, but it's not opposed to our effort. Meaning, when you receive a gift, we don't earn the gift, but you can respond with gratitude and love. Think about this, like this hypothetical scenario. Imagine a dad or mom, you've got a couple kids that are a little bit older, and you reach out to them and you say, hey, we're gonna go to Tanglewood tomorrow, have a picnic. I'd love to invite you to this picnic. Just bring a sandwich or something. It's gonna be good. I'm gonna provide the rest, okay? So the kids are excited to spend time with their parent, and what they do in response to receiving the gift of that invitation is they actually decide to go above and beyond. One of them brings some lawn games, one of them brings some extra lemonade, let's say, and them bringing extra things to this picnic is not what earned them the invite. They got the invite because their father loves them and gives them the invite, and in response, because they feel gratitude and love, they just end up, okay, well, I'll bring some lemonade. I'll bring some of this. So the gift is the invitation. And then the response is, let's make this even better. Let's bring some stuff to it. And that's what happens in our Christian life, is we receive God's grace freely. It changes our hearts from the inside out, and then it leads to change. And that change looks different for different people. Here's what we cannot do. We cannot become fruit inspectors of everybody else's life, determining who's in and who's out because somebody's doing this and not doing this. And plus, you got to realize your spiritual life is like this, okay? My spiritual life has not just been, I trusted Jesus in 19, and you know what? I've just sinned less and less ever since then. That's not my experience. In fact, my experience is it's not the opposite, but it's different in the sense that I am so much more aware of my sin now than I was when I was 19. I actually feel way more broken now. Because God, in his love and mercy, he didn't actually reveal to me all of the ways I was messed up then. But I realize it over time as I walk in relationship with him. He reveals to me the ways that I'm broken, and then he slowly but surely changes me. So you're not supposed to hear this and think, I am not changed enough, so I'm probably not saved. No, you're supposed to hear this and think, where am I placing my trust? Am I placing it in Jesus, or am I placing it in what I do? So empty words cannot save us. There's another thing that can't save us that Jesus mentions in verse 22 when he says this, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? So verse 22 is important because lest we think that doing the will of the Father has to do with religious activity and not intimacy, he clears that up. So he says, if you hear me say, do the will of the Father, and then you think that means do a bunch of religious stuff, and that's what earns your way, think again. Because you can do the most powerful spiritual things, and that is not what saves you. So if you look at verse 22, Jesus starts the verse, he says, on that day. That's a little idiom that refers to the judgment day. He's saying there's a judgment day coming, and on that day, people are going to come and try to justify themselves by all of their religious activity. And a quick word about Judgment Day. So Judgment Day is a day where we stand before God and give an account for our lives. For believers, that is not a day of condemnation. Jesus has already borne the punishment that you and I deserved at the cross. And so the Judgment Day for a follower of Jesus is a day where you get your life evaluated and determines the rewards that you have in eternity. So it's not a day of punishment or condemnation. It's actually a day of commendation and reward because Jesus has already taken the punishment for you. But for unbelievers, it is a day of judgment. It is a day of what did you place your trust in? And Jesus says there's going to be people who say to me on that day, well, didn't I do all these things? Didn't I do all these things? Look at what I've done, Jesus. And what Jesus says is on Judgment Day, you're not supposed to say, look at what I'm doing and look what I've done. You're supposed to say, Jesus, look what you've done. Jesus, look at what you've done for me. And you might have a question about this where you're like, how did these people access this spiritual power and still they weren't true believers? How did this happen? And we can't say exactly where they got their power, but we do see examples in the Bible of people who don't know God accessing spiritual powers other than God to do some miraculous things. You also see examples in the New Testament. It's actually interesting. In Luke chapter 9, there's this story where the disciples, Jesus' disciples, see other people casting out demons in Jesus' name. And the disciples are, they're good little henchmen, so they come up to Jesus and they're like, hey, some guys are casting out demons in your name. We'll tell them to stop. And Jesus says, don't stop them. We don't know exactly where their power came from. We do know that there's power in the name of Jesus, not in the person who wields it. It's not about the vessel as much as it is about the name. So don't get hung up on where did they get their power, how are they not real? And I never do these things, so I might be not a real believer. No, that's not the point. The point is religious activity cannot save you. Even the most extraordinary signs of religious activity cannot save you. It is in Jesus alone. And so here's what we actually find when you look a little closer at what Jesus is saying here, is ultimately these people were trusting in their self-righteousness rather than receiving Jesus' gift righteousness. Because at the judgment day, they point to what they've done rather than what Jesus did. And as believers, that's what we've got to be aware of. We cannot be people who say, did I not do this? Did we not do this? Did we not do this? Instead, we are people who say, Jesus, did you not die for me and die because of me and die instead of me? And now I know that counts for me. That's what believers say. It's not about what I do, it's about what he's done. Jesus, did you not die for me, because of me, instead of me, and now it counts for me? So there's a huge difference between self-righteousness and gift righteousness. Self-righteousness is trusting yourself. Gift righteousness is trusting that Jesus loves you enough to pour his grace into your life and give it to you as a free gift. And here's another observation that we can pull from this passage, is there will actually be some surprises on Judgment Day. There will be some surprises. You know, Jesus says there's some who won't be there that you expect to see there. There are people who are really good at being good, but they weren't reliant on Jesus. But then there'll be others who are there that you did not expect to see. There'll be people who had various colorful pasts who end up there because they've trusted in Jesus. And here's the reality. The biggest sinners are the greatest repenters. You know, it comes back to this reality that the longer you follow Jesus, the more you realize you're sinful, the more broken you realize you are. And so sometimes you're really not a good judge of your own state, not a good judge of how much you've changed, because you might be more aware of the ways that you are still far off from where you want to be. And that's why, again, you don't even look at what you're doing, you look at who you're trusting. That is the key that Jesus is saying here. So the scary part is, this is what Jesus says to people who trust in their empty works. In verse 23, when Jesus says this, "And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness." Now let me point this out once again. Jesus does not say you did not do enough or you did the wrong works. He doesn't say you didn't do enough or you did the wrong works. He says, I never knew you. I didn't know you. They did not know Jesus, and they were trusting in themselves. And if you trust in yourself, that means you're really following your own law and not God's law, which is why Jesus calls them lawbreakers. But the key here is that Jesus is after a relationship, not your resume. Jesus is after relationship, not resume. Superficial, self-righteous religion cannot produce heartfelt obedience. It becomes lawlessness. It becomes lawlessness. So let's get into the brass tacks of why is Jesus after relationship rather than resume? What does that even mean? Well, trusting your spiritual resume will ultimately fail you, and here's why. Because when you are trusting your spiritual resume, what it does is it creates this performance pressure. And it will lead you to anxiety, to pride, and to burnout. You'll always be thinking, am I doing enough? Have I checked the right boxes? And can you have a sustainable, vibrant relationship living that way? What if you're married, or if you're not married, think about this with your friendship. What if in your closest relationships, you had to check a certain number of boxes for that person to be nice to you? Some of you are like, I feel like that in my relationship. Okay, well, that's not how healthy relationships work. It's not about checking boxes. It's about responding to each other in love. And if it is about performance, then it will lead to anxiety, pride, and burnout. Another reason why the resume religion fails is because it creates this transactional relationship between you and God, where it's if I do X, God will do Y. And we know life doesn't work that way. Sometimes the bottom falls out in your life, and maybe there was no cause for it or reason for it other than life. We live in a broken world. And if you have a transactional relationship with God, when things go wrong, you'll run away from him. This is a relationship where Jesus is with you in the valley. He doesn't abandon you when things go wrong. He's with you in it. So the resume religion fails. And one of the key reasons for me that resume religion fails is because it produces a shallow motivation to actually follow Jesus. We obey just so that we are accepted and just so that we feel good, but we don't obey as a genuine response of gratitude and love. Think about like your friendships, or if you're trying to go make a friend, think of it this way. Kids are great because like we have been going to the pool all summer, and our kids are just like, will stare somebody in their soul and they'll say, do you want to be my friend? And then they're friends. Adults don't quite do that as much anymore. But what if you go and try and make a friend, or you're trying to meet some people, do you bring copies of your resume with you to give to people who might be your friend? Hey, before you commit to this friendship, let me show you some of my credentials here. You don't do that. Relationships are about intimacy and knowing each other, not about performance. And a relationship with Jesus is the same way. Resumes are, they're just shallow. Like, why do you even have a resume? You create a resume because you want to get a job. And when you go to that interview with your resume, talking about the job that you want, the goal of that conversation is not relationship. It's, let me like make my weaknesses sound like strength somehow, you know. That's actually a bad approach in an interview, so don't do that. But it's shallow. Like, you don't go into an interview thinking, you know what, I might be best friends with this person that's interviewing me. This could turn into something good. Actually, some of you millennials and Gen Z, you kind of think that way. You're like, you know what, I'm going to this job. Maybe I'll meet my best friend, he's my boss. And then when they tell you to do something, you're like, why is he telling me what to do? That's what we often do. You don't bring your resume into a friendship, you bring intimacy and connection. Why do we try to treat God like that? Why do we try to treat God like he wants our resume, and that his feelings for us change based on how good or bad we're doing in the moment? If you've trusted in Jesus, there's nothing you can do to make him love you more, and nothing you've ever done that makes him love you less. And that is freeing. It's freeing. So that is why resume religion fails, and that's why Jesus warns us against it. Don't trust your resume, trust me. I never knew you. I want to know my people. Why does relational religion triumph? Well, here's what happens, is when you realize that Jesus is after a relationship, it actually gets to your heart. It penetrates past the shallowness of performance and it gets to your heart. And when relationship with Jesus gets to your heart, it gives you rest and security, where you know that you are adopted and that nothing's going to change that. And it gives you this power of obedience that flows from gratitude and love, not from obligation. The only way to make obedience a regular reflex in your life is to receive the love of Jesus and respond to that love with love and gratitude. And this is how real relationships work, guys. We know this. Like, if you on your spouse's birthday, do they want you to buy them a gift because you're supposed to, or because you love them? If you come up to your spouse and you say, hey, it's your birthday, I had to get you something. Here you go. That gift probably won't be received well. But if you give because you love, then that is what creates intimacy, vibrancy. And that's why Jesus says, I've come to give life and life abundant, because relationships change us. And a relationship with the God of the universe is the most transformative relationship you could ever enter into. It will change you. It will change you. I've said this so many times, but here's where we get caught up, is we think that maybe I'm not saved because I haven't changed enough or changed quick enough. Okay, well, spiritual change, deep spiritual change takes time, as I've said, and it's very similar to how your body changes. You know, your body changes and you often don't even realize it. Like you're growing up and then all of a sudden, like for me, I hit a growth spurt, like I was 5'5" in 8th grade, 5'5". I was 6'2" in 10th grade. So that was pretty noticeable. But I actually didn't even realize it. I went from being like, you know, a short, scrawny kid that tried to be fast to a tall, lengthy kid who lost all athletic ability, apparently, and got really slow. I had a basketball coach tell me, hey, Seth, you got a lot taller, but you also got a lot slower. Coaches know how to really love you. But that change happened without me noticing it. And in your life with Jesus, you got to realize that change often happens without you noticing it. And sometimes other people notice it first. You know what I love hearing about people as they grow older, or even as I hear this all the time of people who transition from being, you know, parents to more grandparents. You hear this a lot. It's like, yeah, Dad has really started to chill out. Dad's really like a lot calmer now. Well, do you think he like looked himself in the mirror every day and said, be calmer? No. Over time, through his relationships, it changed him. And that's how it works in our relationship with Jesus. So how do we actually foster a relationship with him? What do we do? Well, there's really 3 things I want to give you. And these 3 things will help you foster intimacy with Jesus so that you can have a relationship with him and not have to give him your resume, right? We got to shift from resume building to relationship building. Here's how we do this. First, we got to be honest before God. We got to be honest before him. That's why Jesus warns us against self-deception in verse 21. Instead of saying, Lord, Lord, and act like everything's okay, why don't you just come to him and be real about how you're feeling, where you're sinning, where you're struggling, what you're thinking, and what you actually believe. You think he doesn't already know? He does know. So come to him and be honest about it. Because the only way to actually experience change is to face the reality of what's going on. And he's the only one that can help take you from unbelief, from struggle, from sin to transformation. Another way to provoke intimacy with God is to run to him, specifically when you sin. Sometimes when we are in sin, instead of running to him, we run away from him, or we try to distract ourselves. And that's not what we're called to do. When we are in sin, we're called to run to him, not away from him, because there is so much grace in Jesus. There's so much more grace in him than sin in you. And he is willing to pay for it. But you've got to receive it. Self-righteousness and pride, it blocks the flow of mercy from getting into our heart, because he can't help us if we trust in ourselves. So we're honest before God, we run to God, and then what we learn to trust God. What do I mean by that? Well, here's the key. Here's a problem we sometimes face, is a lot of times we trust God as a, quote, ticket to heaven. I don't really love the way to say that, but that's kind of how we feel about it. We trust God as a ticket to heaven, but we struggle to trust that the life he shares with us to live is actually better than the life we would lead ourselves. That's why the Sermon on the Mount is so challenging but so practical, because it tells us to do things that are difficult, But we, in relationship with him, learn to actually trust that loving my enemies is what's best. Not retaliating is what's best. Setting limits on my sexual desires is what's best. Dealing with my anger is what's best. So we don't just trust Jesus as our pathway into heaven, we trust him as the way to life right now. Because he wants you to experience the kingdom of God in the present so that you are ready for it in the future. And the more you learn to obey from the heart, the more you will experience what life in God's kingdom is really like. That's where the experience lies. Experience lies in obedience. Give it a try. And here's caveat. When you don't feel like obeying, trust says you do it anyways, and trust that the feelings of love and gratitude will follow. In a marriage, you always feel like what's doing what's best for the marriage? No. But when you make that choice over and over again, over the course of a lifetime, you realize the fruit of that choice was really, really good. Honesty with God, running to God, and trusting God, because in God's economy, we bring nothing to the table except our sin. Nothing. So we fall at the feet of Jesus and say, please, I want to receive your grace in a fresh way. I'm not focused on what I'm doing. I want to be focused on what you've done. And when I focus on what you have done, then it changes me from the inside out. We can't trust in our empty words or our empty works. We need to trust in Jesus alone. So are you looking at what you have done or what Christ has done? In just a moment, we're going to sing together and respond. I think there's a couple ways we can respond, and one that would be really healthy is if you've been trusting in yourself, trusting in your resume, or if you've just not even been fostering a relationship with Jesus at all, come up to the altar and lay that down. Come to the Father. Lay it down, pray. We're gonna have a few folks from our prayer team up here who'd be glad to bear some burdens with you too. And if you're like me at 19 and realize I've been trusting myself, not been trusting in Jesus, I'd love to talk to you after the service. I'll be at the New Here area. Our prayer team would love to talk to you right now when we sing together. We want to help you take your next step with Jesus and actually obey from the heart because of what he's done. So why don't you bow your heads? I want to pray for you. Our prayer team, you can go ahead and move and come forward. And we'll respond in worship together. Father, I pray that we would rejoice in the gift of the Son. That we don't get turned around about what we're doing, but we get enamored with what you have done. And I pray, Father, that we would learn to love you from the heart. It's you alone who can save. Let us not trust in our empty words or if we just grew up in the church. Let us not trust in our empty works, but let us trust in Jesus. These things we ask in his name. Amen. Stand up all across the room. Go ahead and move. Pray at the altar. Sing out to God, and let's worship together.